And today I will be talking with Ton. This is something we haven't done before, and Ton is I would describe Ton as a very valuable, in fact, the invaluable resource in our community, and I thought it would just be a good opportunity to ask him on the bigger picture of how we are doing. So Ton, welcome. I don't think Ton needs an introduction to this audience. Very briefly to say, though, that he used to be the archivist at the Netherlands Red Cross, and has more than anyone helped shape and raise the standards of Sephardic genealogy, for which I'm very happy to publicly thank him, because I think it's a really invaluable service. So before his head explodes, perhaps Tom, we could actually start with the big picture, like on the outside, and you could give us an introduction to the historiography of the Sephardim, and by historiography we mean the sort of the history of the histories of Sephardic Jewry.
Thank you, David. Welcome all. I will give a very brief overview of a subject that really interests me. That is the writing of the history of the writing about Sephardic history. First of all, you had the chroniclers, people who wrote chronological reports about the history of the world, like Abraham Zacuto did. Abraham Zacuto also included the Jews in his Chronicle of the World History. Then there was a Samuel Uske, who was quite famous for having written about the Inquisition, and it's after about the expulsion from Spain and its aftermath, in Consolação as Tribulações de Israel, consolation for the tribulations of Israel. He wrote in 1553, but he could do so almost firsthand. If all of his writings are historically correct, that is another question, but I think what he does manage to do is give us a feel for the horror and the tribulations of the expulsion. Then we go to Holland. Daniel Levy de Barrios wrote about the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community and its history. He's reliable about the history of his own time, but he is less reliable the further you go back in time. And he was obsessed with making the community as old as possible, even older than it was in reality. And David Franco Mendes wrote a more or less chronological story about the same community halfway the 18th century. But history as a science took root in the first half of the 19th century. That is true for history in general. It's also true for the history of the Jewish people. It starts off in Germany with the Wissenschaft des Judentums. This school of thought tried to write history so wie es geschehen, like Leopold von Ranke famously formulated, history as it really happened. That, of course, is nearly impossible, because if you write history and you want to write it like it happened, in the first place you should have been there. And even people who have been there, you hear different stories from different people who have been there. So such a thing to write is very difficult. On the other hand, the Wissenschaft des Judentums was heavily influenced by Romanticism. And also it was critical about the Jews living in Germany at the time, mainly Ashkenazi. And the members of the Wissenschaft des Judentums confronted their view of what they saw as unsophisticated, uneducated Ashkenazim with an idealized version of Sephardim, who were everything that the Ashkenazim were not, well-behaved, endowed with gravitas, educated, interested in science and worldly affairs. The dominant scholar of the time was Heinrich Kratz, whose principal work was History of the Jews in 11 volumes. That one is available online in its entirety. It's still interesting in reading, but you have to keep in mind that his view of Sephardim was very romanticized and idealized. In England and France and America, Jewish studies came to the fore with the establishment of journals devoted to Jewish history, like Jewish Historical Studies, Transactions of the Jewish Historical Society of England, which was founded in 1893, the Revue des Études Juives, 1880 in France, publications of the American Jewish Historical Society, also established in 1893, the same year as the one in England. I wonder if there's a connection there. The field was dominated by distinguished amateur historians like Lucien Wolff, Cecil Walsh in England, Cyrus Adler in America. And to do actual historical research on the spot in those years, you needed to have some money of your own, like Henry Lear did, Richard Gottheil, Herbert Bloom, Samuel Oppenheimer, who crossed the ocean to study Spanish Inquisition archives and Dutch notarial government archives in England. But the influence of the Wissenschaft des Judentums and its romantic view of Sephardim was still being felt. There was also a national or maybe nationalistic aspect to these studies, which expressed itself in the need to show that Jews were there from the beginning of history, with Columbus, with the first Jews in New York during the American Revolution. And the central theme was always the contribution of Jews to the progress of the country. After the Second World War, the theme was taken over by academics, studying and teaching at universities. One of the pioneers of archival research in Inquisition archives is I.S. Reva. His work is still valuable and only available through some effort in libraries, etc. But Karsten Wilke is publishing his original research in French, and the first example of that appeared in 2004, and it was in the form of a book about the Da Costa family of Uriel da Costa, who had family links to Spinoza. The research of Reva led to debates and competing visions about who is a Converso. A Jew, is he a Jew or a Christian? Was the Inquisition a racist institution? What is the value of the declarations of the torture by the Inquisition? Eventually, this led to more nuanced views, like a converso is something in between a Jew and a new Christian, and all kinds of shades of how much a converso resembled a Jew or a new Christian. And someone like Mercedes Garcia Arenal and David Weisbord have pleaded for the converso to be seen as a category on its own. And the general view is that declarations made by prisoners of the Inquisition can and must be checked against other sources. 1992 led to a renewed interest in Sephardic history. And for a while, it looked like the concept of port Jews was a fruitful one. Port Jews entails that Sephardic Jews settled mainly in ports and were central to the trade of their time. That was a fruitful approach, but also a limited one, because not all the Sephardim were merchants. In these days, Atlantic history has emerged as a central concept. How do Sephardim fit in the wider story of migrations, colonial history, trade networks? And it is no longer possible to write about Sephardic communities without that wider framework. And of course, also, that means that it was no longer impossible to ignore slavery. There's a lot more that could be said. Just one more thing. In Holland, we are lucky to have two brand new young professors of Jewish history, Jessica Wortman, who concentrates on that Atlantic history approach, and Bart Wallet, who was recently installed as a professor of Jewish history at the Free University of Amsterdam. I expect great things from them.
Thank you. Could I ask for those historians that are no longer with us? Which one do you rate the most high?
Well, no longer with us.
Well, let's not talk about living historians.
Yeah, Reva. He is my kind of historian, because
so who?
Isaiah Salvador Reva. It's spelled R-E-V-A-H. He wrote in French. He was a Frenchman. He taught at the Sorbonne, and he was my kind of historian because he combined genealogy and history. He taught history by telling his students about Converso families living in Portugal under the Inquisition, and how they were coping with the Inquisition, either outside the Inquisition or as prisoners of the Inquisition. And he provides beautiful genealogies.
Thank you.
He tells stories about ordinary.
Could you say his name again? Give us his name again.
Isaiah Salvador Reva. I'm sorry to say that his work is only available in French.
Something that I sometimes feel is that our history tends to be written from other people's perspectives, and obviously this is something we can discuss a bit later. But in terms of the evolution of the Western Sephardic diaspora, I mean, to massively simplify it, could we describe it as evolving in waves? That maybe there was these very early people in Northern Europe, I don't know, trading pepper and whatever, and then in the sort of 17th century, there was a sort of small community of merchants, and then in the early 18th century, very large numbers of people arriving, or is that just oversimplifying?
No, that's largely correct, because those waves were caused by Inquisition activity. And the Inquisition had ups and downs in its history. It was very active during the 16th century, but towards the end of that century, it's calmed down a bit. And then there was a resurgence in 1609, which led to a wave of Portuguese Jews coming to Amsterdam. And there was another wave a century later when the Inquisition again prosecuted many conversos in Portugal. And in Spain, you see the same ups and downs, but they do not coincide with the Portuguese ones. So those were different waves. But I must stress that the numbers we are talking about are not large. So if you see a tsunami, that's not a correct way of putting it.
Do you think we should understand these three different populations, if that's how we're describing them, as different from each other, rather than just always putting this label? That's to say that the people who were there first are probably going to be the richest, and will be behaving in a particular way and will be more urbane or whatever, and then later generations less so.
Yes, I think that's largely correct. The most rich Portuguese Jews came in during the first half of the 17th century. The ones that came later, some of them were rich, but they also happened to hit upon hard times in Holland because the Dutch golden century was nearly over by the time that the Portuguese Jewish community reached its high point. And that's with the building of the synagogue in 1670.
Okay, in terms of numbers, what do you reckon? I mean, a few weeks ago we were looking at claims for crypto-Judaism, and the Jewish Heritage Alliance is now up to 600 million so-called crypto-Jews. What numbers do you think there were in the? Let's specifically talk about the Western Sephardic community. That's to say, public Jews, and then perhaps, if it's possible, to estimate, how many relatives they may have had in Spain or Portugal.
Yes. Writing about the Inquisition has also become more academic and more thorough, and is based upon more archival research than Reva, for example, could do on his own. The two biggest names to write about the Inquisition are Henry Carmen, who wrote about the Spanish one, and Francisco Betancourt, who wrote a general history of the Inquisition. Both say that the number of Sephardim is much lower than it was generally thought. Like a few years ago, you could still read on Wikipedia that about 200,000 Jews left Spain in 1492, and a lot of them went to Portugal. In 1492, the number of Jews in Spain was somewhat like 80,000. Of course, there were already.
Sorry, can I ask what's your basis for saying that?
That's based on Henry Carmen, and he based himself on various sources, demographics, Inquisition archives, etc.
Okay.
So I take it from an authority, and I didn't check him.
He was a professor at my university. I met him. Sadly, I didn't study history.
Yeah.
Okay, so 80,000 and 80,000.
And these dispersed on the one hand east and south, mainly to the Ottoman Empire, and partly to Italy and to the Balkan. And on the other hand, some 30,000 went to Portugal, where they joined a local population of maybe the same number, maybe somewhat less. Soon they were forced to convert massively, but they were not prosecuted until the establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal, which was late in 1536. And then a first modest wave of merchants went to the southwest of France, and some went on to Antwerp and others to Italy. And only towards the end of the 16th century, more and more conversos left Portugal for first Hamburg, then Amsterdam, later the New World and London. And I did a rough calculation myself on what I could find as population numbers for Hamburg, for Amsterdam, for Livorno, guessing a bit about how many Jews there might have lived in the southwest of France and in the Americas. And I've come to the conclusion that a maximum of 30,000 Western Sephardim lived at any one point in history. That is to say, in 1650, you find that number in 1700. In 1800, of course, it varied through the time, but that's the number I come up with. And if you reckon with 3 generations per century, from 1500 to 1800, I count about 270,000 Sephardim. Of course, that's not a scientific calculation.
In the chat, Torin is saying that the 30,000 number going from Spain to Portugal is a very conservative estimate based on the head tax levied on Jews entering the country. Francoise Soyer, amongst others, estimates that the actual number may have been higher, around 50,000, given the high rates of tax evasion. But it's still relatively low figures.
No, I can accept that, but it's indeed still not anywhere near like the 200,000 who were supposed to have fled to Portugal.
How many do you think first of all, went to Brazil, and maybe how many might have stayed in Brazil? I guess that's that's an impossible question.
Arnold Wissendenser, who based himself upon archives of the West Indian Company in the Netherlands and on other sources, estimates the maximum of Portuguese and Spanish Jews there at 1,500. And that was about half the Dutch that were there. So half, there were another 1,500 Netherlanders, there were 1,500 Dutch Jews, and apart from that, there was the Portuguese population that was already there.
Yeah.
So again, that's not much.
Well, this is probably even more difficult. What would you estimate for the Spanish Americas, if that's even possible?
Well, of course, we know that conversos went to the Spanish Americas. This is documented. And it's difficult to have population numbers in general, and I didn't look them up ahead of this conversation. But if you see for Portugal, for example, that the number of Jews there was 30,000 from Spain, or 50,000 plus 30,000 from Portugal itself, then you get to 80,000. That's 8% of the population of Portugal at that time, which is estimated at 1 million. And of course, those who went to the New World can best be estimated as being of the same percentage. So 8% of those who went would have been Jewish or Converso.
So not very many.
No. In this context, I would like to mention the book published by Stanley Hortz, To the End of the Earth. And he does a very interesting calculation regarding the expedition of Juan Oñate, who went from Mexico to New Mexico. And he had 200 soldiers with him. Stanley Hortz managed to track 30 of them and to find Jewish or Converso ancestry for them. So of those 30, there was one half Converso, if I may say so. One of his parents was a Converso, the other was not. There are two who are 25% Converso, and a lot of the others have maybe one or two Jewish ancestors among their great-grandparents. So as a whole, of those 200, if you can calculate it that way, only a few percent was actually of Converso descent, and many of them were of mixed descent. Now, how many would still be aware of this Converso background 100 years after that, or 200 years after that, or even 300 years after that? So, 100 years after the expulsion, we already find that Converso mixed with Catholics, and undoubtedly that mixing went on and on.
Yeah, I always think that one of our more useful talks was Professor Julia Crete, who is a critic of genealogy, because she feels that we just choose the ancestors that match our own sort of narcissistic feelings about ourselves. So I mean, to stay with the crypto-Judaism movement, if that's what we're calling it, obviously claims of hundreds of millions of people with Sephardic ancestry seem improbable. But do you actually think that that way of thinking, ideology, whatever we wish to call it, is actually having any influence on Sephardic studies, and also more widely how people perceive Sephardim?
My view is that there are two different worlds. There's the world of academic studies, and there's the world of genealogists, politicians, people who want to make a bit of money, who have an interest in claiming more Jewish descent than they actually have, I think. And those two worlds don't meet. There's the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, which is a strange mix of a few academics who write books and articles about conversos, and a large majority of people who feel that they are somehow Jewish, or that their families, who believe that their families have clung to a Sephardic identity through the ages. So it's actually not very much of society for studies as a sort of family for like-minded people. The society tried to get a foothold in academia, and at one time it looked like they had a deal with an American university to host their publication, which is called Lapid. But the deal fell through. Apparently, the professor who promised to do this got knocked on his fingers, and the deal didn't go through. And that's as close as they get to academia as they will probably ever get.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the academic output of Netanya Academic College, I think, I can't remember what it's called. I'm not sure if they have a publication or issue papers in there.
Interesting. I don't. I haven't seen that either. They work together with the Beit Hatzafot Museum, and they don't have a publication as well. So it's Facebook stories, more or less.
Yes. And I think what's interesting about these groups and is that they're very largely Ashkenazi, and of course, before you referenced this sort of historic a situation in Germany where Ashkenazim were sort of idealizing the Western Sephardim, and I wonder, in a funny way, if we're seeing a sort of shadow of this now, where we have sort of Ashkenazim sort of telling us who we are, what our history is, and how we should identify. And again, I just wonder if from that side it's also having an impact on Sephardic studies.
Yes, I think so too. And in Israel, the term Sephardic has already been used as a general label for non-Ashkenazim. And it now includes Mizrahim, Persian Jews, Yemenite Jews, and others, as well as people descended from Iberian Jews. And this, together with the impact of the crypto-Judaic movement and the passport business,
Yes,
has probably hollowed out what the term Sephardic stands for.
yes.
Much like the term Ladino replaced Judeo, Espanol, and Hakatia.
Yes.
So we now also have this initiative to issue certificates of Sephardic origin. And what happens there is that people who receive them name themselves Sephardic, despite that the certificate itself says that this is not a certificate of Jewishness. So that's a further element that is hollowing out the meaning of Sephardim. At the same time, Sephardim itself are quietly dying out, I feel. I don't know how many Sephardim there are at the moment. I think there are thousands. If you look at people connected to synagogues, and there may be a few thousand more who feel that they are Sephardic, but are not connected to a community, and therefore are very difficult to account for, to number them.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with that. Several thousands.
I think in terms of membership of synagogues, certainly in London, I think numbers are going down. I'm not quite sure what the numbers were. There used to be 2,000. They're information in the public domain. I would suspect that Mizrahi members are now outnumbering people of Western Sephardic origin. Yeah, I mean, I think we're a sort of dying breed. I mean, to be honest, largely probably because of the Holocaust, because obviously most of the European Sephardic populations were just annihilated. But yeah, to be clear, because you mentioned the latest nationality certificates, we're not talking about those issued by Spain and Portugal. We are talking about those issued by a unit of the American Sephardi Federation, which has an Ashkenazi chief executive and was previously supporting the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, which is since imploded, which gives me no pleasure to say.
Just a question. Of course, Eastern Sephardim have much higher numbers. There's tens of thousands of them in the United States alone, mostly in Seattle and elsewhere on the East Coast and on the West Coast as well, but not in that high numbers. But they are very much alive.
Well, again, of course, the Holocaust devastated communities. I mean, obviously Salonika, but also in the Balkans. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1930s in Turkey, we see sort of imposed Turkification. So people are having to, speak Turkish, adopt Turkish names, and so on. So and then of course when people went to Israel, they had to enforce Hebraization. So. It survives, but I do sometimes worry that we survive as a cultural artifact for others. I think especially if you look at actually the other day I was looking, I just put the word Sephardic into to YouTube, and apart from our talks, it was mostly about music or food. And again, that's sort of Eastern Sephardic only. And as we mentioned at the beginning, for example, with the this forthcoming Jewish Genealogy conference in London, which I hope everyone will attend anyway. So far, they're saying, well, they're not going to have a Sephardic stream, and obviously in the past. Sephardic content has perhaps not been Sephardic content as we would recognize it. You briefly mentioned the nationality laws in Spain and Portugal, which I think have with you, I think have done a lot of damage to the study of Sephardic history and genealogy, and I think we're now seeing a rise in anti-Semitism in Portugal, consequential to all of the horrible things that happened there.
Yeah, but I do think that there was also a positive side, because many people are now genuinely aware of Sephardic ancestry, and got interested in that history through having a Sephardic great-grandfather or mother. So that happened also.
Yes, I mean, I hear daily from sort of alleged Sephardim in sort of Ukraine and Russia and so forth, and also people in Latin America, and it's kind of difficult. I mean, we discussed this in a previous meeting, that there is this whole underlay that was put down in the early sort of 2000s, claiming that most Iberian surnames were Sephardic and so forth. So I think we've probably got a generation to unpick that particular knot. But moving on, what if any do you think are the big sort of unanswered questions within Sephardic genealogy?
I think that it's still very difficult to follow Sephardic journeys from country to country. And that is from the moment that they fled the Inquisition in Portugal. Where did they go to? You find families in Amsterdam, and you don't know where in Portugal they came from. You find families in on the Netherlands Antilles, in New York. And you know they must have come through London or Amsterdam, but you can't put your finger on it. And it's Sephardic genealogy is still confined by that. And I think there must be a solution to that, but yeah, maybe you have thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, obviously, a number of us are having conversations. I disagree with you. I think it's largely a data processing issue. I mean, if we have so many lists of, of births and circumcisions and marriages and burials and sadaqah and dota and so forth in lots of countries, thus far we have principally been just looking at sort of migration records. But once we have everything, I think, into proper databases, we can do much more, because from one year to the next, hopefully we can have lists of who is in which community. We can see who is coming in and we can see who is leaving, even if we don't necessarily know where they're going. Now, we're not going to pick up somebody who's been in Bordeaux for a couple of weeks and then sent on somewhat to Amsterdam and then, sent off to Curacao or somewhere. But I think a lot of it we will be able to work out, and probably much of the remainder we'll be able to intuit from what we already know. So I think it is just a matter of going through all the data, and obviously at the moment, to give a shout out to Ali's here. David is on holiday, but the work that they're doing is significant in so far as we can now not just look at lists, but we can look at entire documents, and then hopefully we can squeeze much more out. So I'm very optimistic there. The problem, though, I think it just comes back to the whole crypto-Judaism stuff, that if we were to go to fundraisers and say we're looking for lost tribes and all the rest of it, they'll get the checkbook out. If we say, well, we're trying to, compile this database, they'll just go to sleep. But I think the value of what we're doing is enormous there. Mm-hmm. Obviously not just the Transkribus software that we're using for sort of machine reading of documents, but geographical information systems, which we're not really using yet, where we can track where people have moved, but also where they were living within particular cities. And from that, we can get a much greater understanding of, who was rich, who was poor, perhaps who is attending which synagogue and who has become less religious because they've moved away, and so forth. And then, when we start to layer it with other data from the civil authorities and other people, I think the whole way that we do this research will change, and perhaps that leads to another question: that are the genealogists now ahead of the historians, or are we just part of one big team? Because I can say myself that when I started doing genealogy, historians perhaps didn't respect us very much. Whereas now within Sephardic genealogy, I think, you know, they're interested in what we're doing and supportive and even draw upon it.
Yes, I think so too. I mentioned I.S. Reva, but there are more people like him. There's an interest in genealogy and history alike. Those are the best, but there are still historians who cite the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 like it's the God-given truth. So there's a mix there. There are those who take that work seriously and those who ignore it.
Yes, yes.
But it will get better in the future, I'm sure.
I think so. I mean, I think the sort of technology that we're starting to embrace is quite advanced, perhaps compared to a lot of what's going on elsewhere. I'm very aware that whilst we've been yakking away, a lot of people have posted comments and questions. I don't know if anybody wants to make points out loud. It's always perhaps nicer than reading out what is written. If anyone has anything to say, by all means, just raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Yeah, there's a comment from Francis about Jewish and Ashkenazi being used as synonyms, which is unfortunate. There have been a couple of requests that you should post the list of historians that you mentioned to the Sephardic Genealogical Society website. And by the way, everyone, there is a Sephardic Genealogical Society website. It's sephardic.world. I'm afraid it's only got a few pages, but hopefully it's useful. Bernard, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Right. Okay. There I am in something passing for the flesh. Yeah. First of all, I sent a question to Kevin, which got misdirected to somebody else because they were the last person who'd sent a message, and it was about the Cairo Geniza, whether or not you actually had to consult it in person, or whether any of the documents have come out, been digitized, or available online. And I had a couple of points from very early on, particularly, Ton, when you talked about the value of Reva's work as being based on the documents of the Inquisition. One of the problems with Inquisition documents is the Inquisition was denunciation-based. It wasn't fact-based. So it was one lot of people telling a story against, not about, but against another lot of people, which became taken as the facts of the case. And therefore, I think that we need fairly large pinches of salt when it comes to accepting at least the facts as stated in the documents, possibly the facts as stated in the judgments, the punishments, and so on, we might take as being true. I have no idea whether there are records of the enforcement of judgments that were also useful. But I think that, as with anything else, we've really got to be careful. But I think that we're actually at an exciting time where there is a lot of information that people are unearthing, some of it utterly unreliable. Every now and then, odd gems with documentation, which may be slightly less fantasy than somebody's denunciation in the Inquisition, for example. And I think the challenge for us at this stage is twofold. One, to link people's stories and then link those to facts that we can verify and try to fill in the gaps. And the other is all over the world. And I think this partly answers the question about history and genealogy. Genealogy has become very, I suppose the word could be fashionable. A lot of people are doing it. A lot of people are creating family trees, many of them, as always, with a large quantity of fantasy. But I think that the second task is for a group, and possibly some of us could be the core of that, to start setting up cross-referring and creating databases of the different family trees. And there are going obviously to be clashes. And I think that's where also technology comes along, because I noticed, for example, that Genie now gives you lists of inconsistencies that it picks up. And they can be such things as this person had a different name from their brother or sister at birth, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, because we know so many cases where families were changing names, possibly more often than they were changing clothes. But also things saying, for example, this person's date of burial is 25 years after their death, or their date of birth is after their burial. And these are things which at least can be and are being flagged up as inconsistencies, which can then be researched, and it may be eventually possible to correct. But that will come from sharing and cross-referencing information. So it looks to me as if that is where the future of the genealogical historical debate lies. And can I just say one thing on the IAJGS conference? And that is that if they're not running a Sephardic stream as such, that doesn't stop us putting things in. I gathered that the two key streams are going to be UK-based and Western Europe-based. And most of our Sephardic stories in the Western Sephardim pass through either, as David and Todd have already said, London and or Amsterdam. So they're good starting points for making proposals for talks. And you put in as a mention that this will be Sephardic, but you're not looking for a Sephardic stream. Let's just swamp them with Sephardic stories that we're not labeling as such.
Tom, can I sort of jump in and respond to that? On the last point, my particular concern with the IAJGS is that over the years they have repeatedly platformed people making claims about aspects of Sephardic genealogy and history that are speculative at best. So we're talking about crypto-Judaism, we're talking about populations in Eastern Europe and so forth, with the consequential result that the large majority of people involved in Jewish genealogy, who are of course Ashkenazi or researching Ashkenazim, believe these claims to be true. The hope that one has is that London, obviously being, you know, a sort of center of Sephardic research and close to the Netherlands and close to France, which are also centers of Sephardic research, that we could get something different. And I think we'll get certainly a sympathetic hearing. You were saying about Inquisition records. I completely agree. I mean, it's like communist show trials. I mean, you're guilty, with the difference that when you went to communist show trial, you probably didn't have much money, but the Inquisition had an interest in getting your stuff because they wanted to pay the bills. And this is the issue I have with members of my family who were arrested for Judaizing. If there is evidence of that, in most cases, it hasn't survived, and yet when it comes to the Americas, it seems that the very hint of anything like that, and we get everyone secretly lighting their candles in the broom cupboard, and hanging loaves of bread over the door as some sort of strange symbol, and so forth.
Yeah.
With respect to your other point on genie.com, I mean, obviously we've had Randy speak to us about genie.com in the past, and Jarrett and Jacob are also involved in Genie, and there may be a way that we can cooperate, and that's probably a good conversation to have. I think the issue is that they're dealing with public domain data, which probably belongs to other people, and as you say, is a very mixed quality. Whereas we actually, amongst ourselves, we already have quite a large number of family trees. One might hope that the Jewish community of Lisbon, who I think have probably done their research fairly well, would share what they have, but I suspect they wouldn't, because of Portuguese confidentiality laws. But there is a lot of information out there, but I think it might be safer to put stuff together ourselves. I mean, we already have I've sort of written some sort of macros and things which are similar to what the commercial companies are doing, so that as you're saying, somebody can't have died before, can't have been born after they died, and so forth. But we can do better, because obviously the commercial companies have a specific interest in people doing their own research, so they'll only give you sort of part of the information, just a hint, so that you can put the pieces together yourself. But yeah, Ton, I'm sorry, I said a lot. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, back to the Inquisition. Someone who does not agree with you and Bernard is Arias Reva himself. A student of his told this story about him, that during one of his talks at the Sorbonne, he exclaimed, "L'Inquisition se ne trompe pas. The Inquisition does not make mistakes." He took it literally. And of course, within Inquisition files, you can also find different family members talking about the same family, and you can confront those with each other. And in that way, you can come to some sort of truth. And if that information that is being given also correlates to a family coming to Amsterdam in the 1700s or the 1800s, then you know that what was said to the Inquisition has at least some truth in it. So there are ways to establish what is true and what is not. But I see that two other persons have their hands up.
Can I just say, I'm a reactionary on that. I'm with Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who essentially sees the Inquisition as a sort of anti-Semitic venture. But thank you, Bernard. Francis, do you want to unmute?
Yes, I'm coming into the present day, and I went to a meeting at the Jewish Museum in London, which was about theatre in the Jewish community. in Yiddish and theatre, and I watched this thing going through, and there was not a mention of anything before about 1400 or 15 or 1600. The notion that there were Jews who were not Ashkenazi in this country wasn't just ignored, it was absent, completely absent. And when I I quite enjoyed it, was a live performance. I quite enjoyed it. I thought some of it was awful, some of it was very good. But when I pointed out that there was a kind of history of Jews in this country, there was a kind of baffled silence. Now, I was really shocked by that. Is the Jewish Museum, which has I went and talked to the director afterwards. What's his face? I've suddenly forgotten his name. And said, have you got any stuff about Sephardim in this? He said, oh, yes, we have objects. And I said, yes, but there's a kind of history. Have you got that? And he was very sweet, but there was no sense of a trajectory or of a kind of complex and shared developing community through history. It was not there. It was and I think this is normal, actually. The fact that I found it outrageous is probably silly. Now, I would say that if we look at the past and the present, the stuff that you're talking about is astonishing and extraordinary, because my ancestors were kicked out of Spain like everybody else's. But I think that we shouldn't be kicked out of society in the way that the Jewish Museum is kicking us out. I would really like, David and Ton, if we could go and talk to them and try to look at how a structural, I think it may not work, but as a kind of political, cultural act, it might be worth doing some of this. I mean, maybe we can talk about it. But I was really, really discombobulated. I was quite witty about it as well. I wasn't upset. Mm-hmm. But really, really, it's a bit much. Have you been to that museum? Thank you.
I mean, the good news there, or hopefully the good news, is the Jewish Museum are collaborating with the Bevis Marks Heritage Foundation in developing the community calls it a visitor center. Everyone else calls it a museum, but whatever it is. So hopefully that will be okay. My concern slightly is that they're just getting all the old silver out of the bank vault and putting it on display. And
yes.
Perhaps not necessarily, I'm sure it's very beautiful, but perhaps not necessarily telling the story. But we will actually, Howard Martin and one of his colleagues from that committee spoke to the JGSGB at their conference a few weeks ago, and perhaps we can see if they'll come and sort of reprise their talk to us, because I think hopefully they'll find us sort of helpful and useful.
But actually, could I just say one more thing?
Of course.
I would like to be helpful and useful, but this blindness is chosen. It's hegemonic. I'm not saying it's vicious. I'm saying that it's a kind of trajectory which needs to be broken somehow or disrupted.
I have to say I kind of disagree. I think in Britain especially, because of the history and the Board of Deputies, where the early Ashkenazim and Sephardim got together and everyone else afterwards was funneled through that. I do think that we have a presence and a recognition that perhaps, for example, doesn't exist in the United States, where I think most British Jews have a sort of awareness of a Sephardic community. But if we're whatever we are, like 5% or less, I think naturally, I mean, I don't think there's any malice there whatsoever. I think it's just,
I'm not saying malice.
No, I understand that. I think it's just natural. But I think anything we can do to raise our profile. I mean, I really don't want to go into this whole kind of diversity and raising awareness things. I think we're strong enough just to on our own on our own merits to make our case rather than victim claiming. But yeah, Bruce.
Yeah, I thank Frances for her etiquette in raising the issue. I just wanted to come back to really where Ton and you, David, and Ali and others have excelled, which is the only way you can solve some of these data science issues is to have a metadata standard for what counts as proof. A family tree, to my way of reckoning, is an abstraction of the data of a birth, death, or other record. So it's almost like an application like Excel that uses other data to display that data in a familiar form. And so what the Sephardic Genealogical Society, I think, stands for, as you've all practiced it, is the authenticity of that metadata source, and that there are a finite number of sources that are being rediscovered over time, but for each family that claims its Sephardic ancestry, when asked for its proof, could either validate that the metadata catalog is complete, or add a new authenticated source. That kind of curation of data, obviously Ton has been just brilliant about giving us the skinny on archives in Amsterdam, and you, David, in Bevis Marks, but whatever that metadata standard is would be incredibly valuable as prima facie evidence that if you're citing something in the metadata catalog, it's true. If not, we would take it as potentially an abstraction of once true or once believed to be true data. And I think those kind of standards would be really, really wonderful for the data science pieces of this puzzle to come together from all over the world, And I know you and I, David, have had, some really great back and forth, and I thank you for that.
I think so. And what we haven't mentioned also is the genetic side of things. So that the Avatano DNA project obviously are doing work on that. I mean, theoretically, if we can do a family tree of the Anglo-Sephardim, we can then also do some research on the matrilineal lines, at least those that came out of the Iberian Peninsula. With respect to autosomal DNA, I am aware of software. I think there's one called DNA Painter, where you can sort of work out which bit of your DNA came from which grandparent, and then theoretically, I suppose, if you have enough participants, it might be possible, and this is really not my subject, so I might be talking complete nonsense, but it might be possible to go back a number of generations further than people normally believe. I think normally they say you can get back to 5 or 6 generations, but maybe it could be pushed back a couple more. So there's a lot of technology out there. There's also obviously lots of rules, concerns about privacy and so forth. But yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with you, Bruce, that it's a data processing. I see it as a data processing issue rather than anything else. Ali, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I just want to go back to the point that Ton and you made about the sort of, I suppose, Venn diagram of historians and genealogists. And I think I can maybe offer a little bit of an insight on this, because I'm a kind of novice in both camps. I became interested in the genealogy side through my wife's ancestry, as I've said before, and that kind of led to an interest in Sephardic history as well. And I've now, in my dotage, decided, taken up a master's studies in history, in local history, and writing my dissertation on one aspect of Sephardic history. So I'm getting a little bit of a sort of feel for where they rub together and intersect. And two things I'm going to say. I mean, historians come in many different flavors. So you've got national histories, you've got multinational, international histories, economic history, social history, these kind of big genres. But I think where maybe with genealogy, the greatest intersection is with two linked types of historians, and that's local historians and demographic historians. So local is demographic because that by its very nature has to be localized. And local historians are interesting because they look at kind of under a microscope and can see things that you can't see in the national picture. But of course, that kind of has to then be knit into the national picture and the international picture. But you have to start at the very local level. So, for example, looking at sources, you might use the same sources. So, for example, a local historian, like I'm doing, could use the Bevis Marks birth, marriage, and death records, the accounts, the Askamot, all these things to kind of put together a picture of the social structure of the community in a certain time period, and create kind of almost like reconstruct the families that were there. And this is something that genealogists might do too, using the same sources. But then it starts to diverge, because what the genealogist is looking for is the life histories of specific families. And whereas what the historian is looking for is kind of more the aggregate pictures, for example, of demographics like mortality and nuptiality and fertility and these sort of things that will throw light on wider society. They might be interested in individual families as case studies, but that's not really what the historian is about. So I think there's a sort of point in that process of both forming genealogies and forming histories where there's a real intersection. And I kind of only just am starting to discern where that is, that could be really useful to focus on. One of the problems is that they don't really talk the same language. They use different software, they use different terminology. Genealogists will use the GEDCOM standard, whereas historians are pretty unaware of that. I think I've seen one article in a historical journal saying how useful GEDCOM might be, the demographic historian. So there's a lot of work to do before you can actually knit them together. That's really what I wanted to say.
Yes. Thank you. If I may react to that, I think a serious genealogist also needs to look at the bigger picture. He has to read up on his history.
Yeah.
He has to read the local historians. He has to read the general historians. For Sephardic genealogy, it will be useful to have a few languages at your disposal. So I think a genealogist who does it right also looks at the bigger picture. I'm not very sure about the other way around. If historians generally go into the details of a family, how it was composed, their life stories. They might use one or two as an example, but only as examples. I agree with you that this is an interesting subject, and I would like to call for a conference on that with genealogists and historians. Maybe that's something for us to organize, David.
Yeah, somewhere hot, hopefully. Thank you. So Kevin, you've been waiting patiently.
Patiently. Okay. Back to the beginning. We talked about the number of people who left Castile from Portugal. As far as I understand, many left, many returned back to order, they didn't have the money, and those who got were expelled in the year. So can someone clarify?
So Kevin, the audio is letting us down.
Oh. Hold on. It's showing my audio as well. Can you hear me now?
No.
Oh, that's very weird. My apology. Hold on.
So
It was better just then.
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go around the board. Okay. Earlier on in the conversation,
I'm so sorry. It's really
okay. Any better now?
No.
no.
Wrong with the system now.
Do you want to type something and we'll read it out?
Sorry?
Do you want to type something and we'll
I'll do it now.
Okay, thank you.
No,
Kevin, it's better when you talk directly towards your screen for some reason. The microphone might just be the kind of positioning of the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
No.
If I do another screen, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Yeah?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I've gone. We talked about the number of people, refugees from Castile in 1492 that fled to Portugal.
Yes.
Now, I was told that many were actually not allowed in because they didn't have enough money, and the others that got in were expelled within 2 years. The number that actually stayed in Portugal was very, very small. So can someone clarify this?
I would have to read up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was told categorically, and it makes sense because if you think about it, the people later were very proudly Portuguese, the Nacio Portuguese. They were very proud.
Mhm.
You didn't get that, I'm Castilian, I'm from Toledo, I'm from wherever, like you did in the East. So can someone, can I ask somebody to check? Because it's fascinating. It affects the numbers big time. If the numbers actually stayed were maybe a few hundred, not 20,000. Yeah, fair question.
Yeah, fair question. And I will have to read up on that. I'll look up what Francis Sawyer says about this. And there was a Portuguese historian who counted all the Portuguese in 1492. She came up with the number 30,000. So
yeah, I mean, everything I read said, yeah, a lot got in, but they were expelled. Part, I think, to do with the marriage of John to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella.
Mhm.
So anyway, that'd be interesting. The other thing I found fascinating was these letters, and answer Bernard's question, from the Caraganesa. Fascinating letters written by Sardim in Egypt, obviously, communicating with their families all over the known world, even those who remained in Spain after converting. Quite fascinating. And the other one, did you read my note there about the actual, which one, numbers? The Jewish community in America in 1790 was a total of 3,000 maximum.
Yeah, including
Sephardim and Ashkenazi. No, I'm just saying the numbers.
Okay, we've lost you again.
Carry on the great work.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. On YouTube, actually, Jarrett has joined us. You could have asked him; we would have let you into to Zoom. He says, I agree with Ton. I find a lot of historians assume genealogists only focus on the fantasies, when I find the best genealogists look at the larger story. So I think we can agree with that.
That's 1-0 for the genealogist.
Okay. Doris, you're unmuted. Do you want to speak?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I've belonged now, I think, for a couple of years to your group, and I found the presentations fascinating. I'm speaking from Seattle, but I have many friends in the Sephardic community, but that's not my main interest. My main interest is really doing my own family's genealogy, genealogical research, and trying to find my supposed Sephardic ancestor. I've gone the Y-DNA test route, and we indeed, according to Adam Brown, there's some evidence that yes, there is a Sephardic background in my Pinto's family, but again, it's to try, and his advice was, well, you still have to do the basic research, family research. And I am not quite sure how to do that. I find myself increasingly frustrated trying to do that remotely. I'm not able to travel to Europe at this point. I've lived 10 years in London, and I was born in Aachen, so I have ties to Holland. We've been there. But how can I do this research? I don't know if the ancestors came through Amsterdam, possibly. I'm interested in the despacho records. Can I access those remotely online? I would like some more information. Possibly my forefather might have come through Italy. There's some evidence of that. Where are these records? Are there sources to research these records in either Italy, Bordeaux, or Antwerp, or any number of routes they could have come? Might be helpful to get a list of the appropriate people to contact in these areas. I'd appreciate some help.
I would say send us an email and send us as many details about your family as you can.
Yeah, I've tried that.
Okay.
I'll try it again.
I'll type I'll type in my email address in chat. Now find the right person. Doris. Okay. To everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll take a look.
Okay, so there's a sort of discussion going on about what particular standards might be used to sort out the data. I'm a fan of GEDCOM, the one that's used by genealogists, just because that's the easiest way, GEDCOM's easiest format to output or to share genealogical data. I mean, we would obviously have to have our own adaptation. Bob is saying that genealogical data is profoundly variable because so many humans are involved, and death certificate is dependent on who's providing it. And also, of course, we have information which is not true. I mean, for example, the Belinfanti family claimed to come from Portugal and probably come from Yugoslavia and so forth. But I think that's just par for the course, and maybe in time genetics will provide us with answers. Other Bob has a link to the IIJG, which is the, gosh, what's that? It's the International Institute for Jewish Genealogy, who I think are in Jerusalem, who try to encourage upmarket genealogy. Bruce is asking about a particular the Family History Metadata Working Group, led by Dr. Luther Cionovich. I'm afraid I've not heard of that, but it actually looks quite interesting. So we'll have to look at that. I'll just see. There's a lot of conversation on YouTube. Okay. Ton, gosh, it's 8:30. Oh dear. Perhaps, unless anyone else has anything to add, perhaps we should wind up now. So I'd very much like to thank Ton both for this evening and also for all the work he does, which is absolutely invaluable. And he is the engine. He is the engine in our machine, and we are very grateful to him for that. We are also very grateful to our patrons. Having said that, if any of the patrons have any thoughts about where we can raise funds for this larger sort of family tree related project, we'd be very grateful to hear about that. And to say that we shall be back next week. We will actually try to get hold of the people from the Bevis Marks project, because it's as well as points made, I think it's interesting in itself, and they might be useful allies for us in the future. But many thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Ton. Ton, do you have any last pearls of wisdom to impart?
You blow too much adulation my way.
Don't worry, you'll pay in futures.
Sarcasm, not adulation.
not true.
I'm a great fan of bluffing your way through. Thank you all, and see you next